Welcome back to our read on contemporary society and the primary institutions of the arts, music, and communications. This is video 6F Part 8, which continues our focus on the communication platforms embedded in the mega media corporations. In this part, we will continue examining the state of our print and radio communications. We will discuss we have experienced division in American news media, and how that division has led to polarization along ideological and moral beliefs. In turn, we'll discuss how the polarization has infected much of the American news media with a relentless bias, and how that bias is distorting the news we hear and see. There is a huge issue in American news media across the print, electronic, internet, and radio communication companies, and this issue is directly tied to the underlying division in the communications industry. A division, as we have shared, which is along ideological and moral beliefs. And over the past several decades, especially over the past 20 years, this division has grown more pronounced and entrenched throughout American media. This division has been inflamed by a host of contributing causes: academia, outside billionaire financing, deep cultural issues, inflaming a young and restive population, by companies aggressively magnifying issues and divide in order to expand reach and profits. And by consequence, when rolled up together, it has pulverized our communication industry from stem to stern into a decidedly opposite, stubborn camps of left and right, each invested in their respective ideology to the exclusion of the other. And this polarization has been allowed by the owners and financiers of the media communication companies across the spectrum. They've enabled this distortion through their deliberate action and/or inactions, through ignoring their responsibility to our culture and to the American public, to communicate based on the ideals of truth and honesty. They have explicitly allowed the polarization to deepen its roots in corruption in the various subsidiaries of mega media, inclusive of TV networks, cable, mainstream media news, inclusive of the big newsprint companies, and of course, the new frontier of digital internet communications. And this polarization has been allowed to grow and overtake nearly the entire industry. It has occurred because the responsibility for exercising the mature guidance by owners, industry executives, and senior managers in stewarding their industry and strengthening our culture through the prevention of ideological imbalance in their newsrooms has not happened. They've shirked their role, abandoning integrity for populist propaganda, and despoiling the truth in our communications. And as a result, a rotting bias in the industry has grown in the minds and persona of these companies, a bias which tears at our culture with dishonesty, lies, political motivation, and deceit. A bias which has pushed a once fairly objective and honest profession into abandoning journalistic standards for accuracy, honesty, and reporting, away from balanced, critical analysis and examination. And unfortunately, into a cheapened message to the American public, into manipulation instead of communication, into omitting facts and slanting the message, into underreporting instead of full disclosure, into prejudiced opinion instead of news, all of which has severely damaged media integrity in this country. Forget the smiling faces on the camera. They're meant to disarm your intellect and sensibilities. As a fish swallowing the hook, these folks are looking to lure you into their deception. They'll mix in truth with their lies to keep you off guard, confused. They'll conflate issues and facts, whatever works, and they will surely seek to hook you with their deceit. And there's becoming a more severe casualty due to the pervasive bias, the truth. Today, more than in any other time in the past 15 decades, an accurate and truthful message is frequently muted, distorted, or altogether lost. It's happening in news reporting, in commentaries, and in talk shows. This bias has descended across American media and has corrupted the honesty in our news communications. And there is consequential impact to the American public. The nation is being outright cheated out of the honest dialogue and debate on important issues facing our nation, on important and urgent priorities we must deal with as a unified country, not as a squabbling, divided nation. America is now being deliberately misled, and our discourse, debate, politics, and policies are the casualty. The mainstream media bias is decidedly for those viewpoints, opinions, news stories which positively support morally relative positions, most typically referred to as left, liberal, and progressive-leaning sentiments, and essentially against absolute morality, or what we would commonly refer to as traditional, foundational, and conservative ideology. For example, when we look at the major weekly news magazines and their .com subsidiaries, we see a decidedly liberal slant, as the Media Research Center indicated when looking at the subject. Branching out to different periodical magazines, which principally deal with social and political topics, we find even more bias in place. It is generally a heavy bias and almost always against conservative viewpoints, ideals, and leaders, and almost entirely advocating for liberal progressive points of view, especially in support of morally indifferent and relative values. These magazines and others like them oftentimes champion liberal topics ad nauseum, and likewise ignoring or underreporting news stories which are supportive of conservative or Christian values. Here's a few more magazine covers demonstrating the bias in print communications. We see Newsweek and Esquire adoringly and positively portraying the last two Democratic presidents on their covers, Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. They're looking like confident leaders ready to move the nation forward. And comparatively, we see how The Economist, Newsweek, and Esquire treat Republican presidents, Trump and George Bush, in negative, despicable terms, making them look like imbeciles or mentally unbalanced. Now we have GQ, Gentleman's Quarterly, once a stellar magazine for men and fashion, honoring as a Citizen of the Year Colin Kaepernick. In doing so, disrespectfully attacking our culture, with disrespect to our national symbols and troops, by honoring those who ignorantly trash our national values for purposes of left-wing politics. GQ would rather honor someone who has done nothing for the nation than honor those who have served our country with courage and distinction, having sacrificed their lives and limbs for our freedoms, having sacrificed for the innocent and truly victimized. Vanity Fair, a magazine read by millions of women across the country and Mexico, depicts the First Lady, Melania Trump, on its cover, eating jewels. How disrespectful and ugly is that impression? Then, November 2017 rolls along, and as tradition has it, the White House is decorated for the Christmas holiday season and guided by the First Lady in theme, taste, and splendor. And she does a simply magnificent job with color, light, art, and beauty. From room to room, the festive decorations delight, giving the onlooker a warm sense of tradition and the blessings of Christmas. Each main room of the White House is carefully themed in color and message, each unique and respectful. Even a touching creche is artfully displayed, not ignoring the meaning of the season. And Melania herself is exquisite and elegant, as she graces through the outstanding Christmas decorations, perhaps the most beautifully done in the history of the White House. And Melania graciously hosts young guests in an experience of a lifetime, enjoying the resplendent decorations and hospitality of the White House. So how does a women's magazine like Vanity Fair cover the event? Sharing a piece on the first White House decorations by an incoming president and his First Lady? Well, it's unlike the flattering, gushing coverage Michelle Obama received each year for 8 years over her Christmas decorations at the White House. Vanity Fair sees to it to give Melania Trump a snarky article. Kenzie Bryan writes, "It's safe to assume we have some clarity as to what she's been up to when not traversing the Great Wall of China, or making an appearance at the turkey pardoning ceremony. Maybe." What's the maybe for? Are we supposed to doubt Melania's been doing something of importance? Rather than commend her for a wonderful job, she gets a dishonest and sarcastic tone. From the author Kenzie Bryant. Here's another example in the same article. Instead of complimenting the art of ballet dancers floating through the hallways like Christmas angels, Bryant writes, and we quote, "Here, Melania is watching the performance. Adequately done," she probably whispers to the principal. "I only counted 4 mistakes." Not a real quote, mind you. The Vanity Fair author puts the words in Melania's mouth to depict Melania as a snobbish, spiteful woman, exactly the opposite of who she really is as the First Lady. And to top off Bryant's mendaciousness, she takes a last swipe in ending her article, using an after-hours picture when the night has descended. Bryant alludes to nightmares and Halloween. This is exactly how the liberal, morally relative press behaves, attempting to put down the First Lady, as well as the recognition of all involved and the holiday itself, and it's disgusting. Here's a contrast to think about. On the right is the photo Kenzie Bryant chose to close her Vanity Fair article, leaving the reader with an ugly, uneasy impression of Melania. We think it's more a reflection of the darkness of left liberal biased souls and the way they see the world, the way Kenzie Bryant sees the world, the way apparently Vanity Fair sees the world. Here, in contrast on the left, is the way Melania Trump sees the world, reflecting what is genuinely in her heart and in her soul, reflecting a tone of good morality, of deep beauty and love. You decide what world you want to live in, Melania's or Kenzie's. Here we have Rolling Stone magazine printing a story of campus rape, sensationalizing a serious issue for politically correct ratings, and consequently smearing and diminishing the public image of a noble institution of learning, and by association, the people attending there. The story, it turns out, was a gross example of shoddy journalism and incompetent editing, and when the truth comes out, the magazine is charged by many in promoting fake news. The real story here was the loose standards and emotional frenzy that typify the left liberal editorial staff, where truth and accuracy is slaughtered at the altar of progressive journalism. Newsweek, again showing its unrelenting bias against Trump and anything conservative, has the audacity, or better put, the idiocy, to compare President Trump to Charles Manson. Of course, there's no likeness in any universe, except that far, far away one Newsweek must exist in. Even overseas, the print media and magazines are heavily biased. Not a surprise, knowing that Europe especially has turned decidedly secular and morally relative over the past several decades. Here we have the German magazine Der Spiegel depicting President Trump as a maniac anti-liberal zealot, much like an ISIS figure with a knife in hand, cutting the head off the Statue of Liberty, simply because he supports American interests first, as he should. Here we have Ireland's political and cultural magazine called Village, imaging President Trump on its cover, with a gun sight targeted on his head, with the caption, "Why not?" There are more examples than just these two, yet they're all consistent with one thing. They all reflect an animus towards conservative, traditional, and oftentimes Christian ideals. We see this inherent bias in mainstream media across all communications, inclusive of radio, particularly when it comes to talk and news shows. On June 20th, 2007, the Center for American Progress and Free Press released the first of its kind statistical analysis of the political makeup of talk radio in the United States. Their analysis confirmed that talk radio is one of the most widely used media formats in America, and it's dominated almost exclusively by conservatives. They found that of the 257 news talk stations owned by the top 5 commercial station owners, 91% of the total weekday talk radio programming was conservative, and only 9% was progressive. Each weekday, 2,570 hours of conservative talk are broadcast on these stations, compared to 254 hours of progressive talk. 76% of news talk programming in the top 10 radio markets is conservative, while 24% is progressive. If you were to take the top 25 talk radio hosts by audience and reach, the majority of shows and their listening audience is clearly conservative. Audience reach for conservative shows is about 87 million listeners a week, compared to 24.5 million listeners of liberal radio talk shows. Therefore, clear advantage to right conservative side of the spectrum. We also see this inherent bias in mainstream news media, occurring in the print newspapers across the country. Although print news is declining, as many companies ramp up digitally on the internet, the print news companies still command significant circulation in many metro areas, especially within the largest cities and population centers. Unlike the radio world, we find the opposite bias in print newspapers, and they are firmly and heavily biased towards liberal, progressive agendas. Day after day, all year long, they tout left liberal slant to their news stories, employing a variety of techniques to create narratives which amplify liberal progressive messaging, while muting or ignoring conservative facts and perspectives. This occurs on front pages, in headline stories, and invariably in the opinion commentary sections. There are a few centric newspapers with balanced ideological perspectives with regional or national reach. The Wall Street Journal is sometimes mentioned as a good centric example, generally balanced from an ideological perspective and trusted for accuracy and good factual analysis. And there are also few right-of-center newspapers, which typically have at best a local or regional circulation, like the New York Post, which generally counters the Times and the New York Daily News. And many local and regional newspapers follow the lead of large metropolitan papers, as smaller news houses lack the resources to develop news stories by themselves, unless it's local. Routinely, local and regional papers source their news stories from large mainstream liberal newspapers, like the New York Times, the LA Times, Chicago Tribune, or Washington Post. Or they get stories from newswires, like the Associated Press. According to the Media Research Center, the top 25 newspapers by circulation located across the United States, when ranked, are either liberal or conservative in disposition. 21 were ranked liberal, and only 3 were ranked conservative, not exactly balanced. When you look at the actual circulation totals to understand the density of reach, we see an overwhelming number for the liberal papers, reaching up to 11.7 million readers a day. And were regional and local papers included, the total would be much higher. In contrast, for the conservative papers, only 1.3 million readers a day are reached. And here again, as we mentioned in the prior video, we refer to Cheryl Atkins' graphic on how media lines up, either left or right, depending upon whether they have an inherent liberal or conservative bias, respectively. Here, we can see depicted in yellow outline how lopsided the newspapers lean to the left, along with major news generators like AP and Reuters. And on the right, highlighted in red, you can see just a few papers. Clearly, American newspapers are ideologically unbalanced in favor of liberal progressive points of bias. This concludes 6F Part 8. We encourage you to go on to Video Narrative 6F Part 9, where we will continue examining the state of our communications, focusing on TV, cable, and media news, both national mainstream and local. We will discuss the heavy bias in today's news organizations and provide some insights into the prevalent corruption of the media culture, both on a moral standards level and in ideology.